Some nights change a life forever, and sometimes that night arrives wrapped in Christmas lights. Snow drifted slowly over the quiet streets of Manhattan as the Whitmore estate glowed like something out of a winter postcard, its towering windows spilling warm golden light across the perfectly manicured lawn, while a 12-foot Christmas tree shimmered in the grand foyer, covered in crystal ornaments that caught the chandelier light like tiny stars. And Naomi Carter Whitmore stood at the edge of the marble staircase, watching guests arrive with the calm grace everyone expected from the billionaire's wife, her deep emerald evening gown flowing softly around her and the diamond ring on her finger catching the light each time she lifted her hand to greet another guest. Because Christmas at the Whitmore mansion was never just a holiday. It was an event, a spectacle, a carefully curated moment where power and elegance blended into one perfect image. And Naomi had spent 5 years mastering the quiet art of belonging in a world that had never fully welcomed her. The orchestra in the corner of the ballroom played a gentle version of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, the notes floating through the air like snowflakes while champagne glasses clinked and laughter echoed beneath ceilings 20 feet high. And everywhere Naomi looked there were familiar faces from Alexander Whitmore's world. Venture capitalists, senators, media executives. People who spoke the language of influence as naturally as breathing. Yet despite the warmth of the room, Naomi felt a strange stillness inside her chest tonight. A quiet instinct she could not explain. The kind of feeling that arrives just before something in life shifts forever. Alexander stood across the room near the fireplace speaking with several board members, his tall frame unmistakable in a tailored midnight black suit, his silver cufflinks reflecting the firelight, every movement confident, and measured the way powerful men move when they know the world listens. And when he laughed, the crowd around him leaned slightly closer, as if gravity itself tilted toward him. Because Alexander Whitmore had built one of the fastest-growing tech empires in America before turning 40, and people treated him like a man who could bend the future with a phone call. But Naomi knew another version of him too, the quiet man who worked past midnight in his office overlooking Central Park, the man who sometimes stared through the window as though searching for answers no empire could buy. And tonight something about the way he held himself felt different, colder somehow, like winter had found its way into the room despite the roaring fire behind him. Naomi descended the staircase slowly, her heels tapping softly against the marble as conversations softened around her presence. Because even in a room filled with wealth, she carried a natural elegance people could not ignore, the kind that came not from money but from resilience, from years of standing tall when life tried to bend you. And as she reached the final step, Alexander looked up, and their eyes met across the ballroom for just a second, a brief flicker of something unreadable passing through his expression before he raised his glass to get the attention of the room. The music faded. Conversation stopped. Crystal chandeliers hummed faintly above as hundreds of eyes turned toward the billionaire host. Alexander waited until the silence settled completely, the way a man does when he understands the power of a moment. Then he spoke with the calm authority that had convinced investors to place billions in his hands. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," he said smoothly, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Christmas has always been about family, about celebrating new beginnings." Naomi felt the faintest tightening in her chest as he continued speaking, the instinct inside her growing stronger with every word. "And tonight," Alexander added, lifting his glass slightly higher, "our family has unexpected news." Guests leaned forward, curiosity moving through the crowd like a ripple across water. Alexander glanced toward the far side of the ballroom where a tall blonde woman stood beside Naomi's mother-in-law, Charlotte Whitmore. And when he spoke again, his words landed in the room with a quiet shock that seemed to freeze the air itself. "My mother-in-law," Alexander announced calmly, "is pregnant." For a moment no one moved. The orchestra sat frozen. Champagne glasses hovered halfway to lips. Naomi remained perfectly still at the bottom of the staircase as the sentence echoed through the hall, because in that instant she understood something no one else in the room did. Something hidden beneath the polished words and polite smiles. Something that made the Christmas lights above them suddenly feel colder. And as whispers slowly began spreading through the guests, Naomi Carter Whitmore realized that tonight was not a celebration at all. It was the beginning of a story no one in this room was ready to hear. The silence that followed Alexander Whitmore's announcement did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like ice under pressure. A whisper first, then another. Soon the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate was humming with confusion as elegantly dressed guests leaned toward one another, trying to understand what they had just heard. Charlotte Whitmore stood near the fireplace with perfect composure, her posture tall, her silver hair arranged immaculately, the portrait of dignity expected from the matriarch of one of New York's most powerful families. Yet Naomi Carter Whitmore noticed something in her expression that most of the room missed, a tightness in Charlotte's smile that looked less like joy and more like calculation. Naomi remained at the bottom of the marble staircase, her emerald gown brushing softly against the polished floor while the golden lights from the towering Christmas tree reflected across the room like quiet constellations. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply watched as Alexander lowered his glass and allowed the announcement to settle into the crowd. Someone near the back of the ballroom finally laughed in disbelief, assuming the statement must be a strange holiday joke, but Alexander did not laugh. His face remained calm, composed, and the stillness of his expression carried the unmistakable weight of truth. "Life surprises us all," he added smoothly, his voice steady, as if he were presenting quarterly earnings to a board of directors rather than delivering family news. "Our family will be welcoming new life next year." The orchestra members exchanged uncertain glances before slowly resuming the soft melody they had paused moments earlier, though the music now sounded distant, as if it were drifting through another room entirely. Naomi's gaze shifted toward the woman standing beside Charlotte. Vanessa Cole, tall, elegant, wrapped in a pale winter dress that shimmered beneath the chandelier light. Vanessa held a champagne flute but had not taken a sip. Her eyes moved quickly through the crowd, measuring reactions, absorbing the whispers with a calm that looked rehearsed. Naomi felt something cold and precise settle into place inside her mind. It was the kind of clarity that arrives when confusion disappears and truth reveals itself in silence rather than words. Across the ballroom, Alexander finally looked toward her again. Their eyes met. Briefly. For 5 years Naomi had learned how to read the smallest details in his expressions. The tightening of his jaw when a negotiation shifted. The faint lift of his eyebrow when someone lied in front of him. Tonight there was something else in his gaze. Not guilt. Not regret. Something closer to distance. Like a door quietly closing. Applause suddenly erupted from a small group of investors near the bar who assumed the announcement must signal some unusual family celebration. And within seconds the rest of the room followed politely, because wealthy circles had a way of applauding even when they did not understand the reason. Crystal glasses clinked again. Conversations restarted. Yet the energy had changed. Guests glanced toward Naomi more frequently now, curiosity hidden behind polite smiles. The billionaire's wife stood alone at the foot of the staircase while the story unfolded around her without explanation. Charlotte Whitmore approached Alexander and placed a hand lightly on his arm, her smile widening as cameras from 2 society reporters captured the moment from across the ballroom. Naomi noticed the careful choreography of it all, the positioning, the timing, the way Vanessa remained half a step behind Charlotte, as if she had rehearsed exactly where to stand. The pieces aligned with quiet precision inside Naomi's thoughts. Christmas lights reflected across the tall windows of the estate, while snow continued falling outside over the silent streets of Manhattan. Inside the ballroom, warmth and laughter slowly returned, as if the evening had never paused at all. Yet Naomi understood something none of the guests realized. This announcement had not been spontaneous. It had been designed, prepared, delivered at the exact moment when the room was full enough to witness it. When the orchestra played the final notes of the song, Naomi lifted her chin slightly and took a slow breath, the faint scent of pine from the enormous Christmas tree drifting through the air. Then she turned her gaze toward Vanessa Cole one more time. And in that quiet instant Naomi Carter Whitmore understood that the story everyone in the ballroom believed had just begun was not the real story at all. The real story had started long before tonight, and only 3 weeks from this moment the truth would begin to surface in ways none of them were prepared to face. The music continued, but the harmony of the evening had already shifted. Naomi Carter Whitmore stood quietly near the base of the staircase while guests returned to their conversations, their voices now softer, threaded with curiosity that floated through the ballroom like faint smoke. Wealthy circles rarely asked questions out loud, but their eyes spoke constantly, and Naomi could feel them glancing toward her again and again as the story of the night began forming in whispered speculation. A server passed by carrying a tray of sparkling drinks and paused just long enough to offer her one with a polite smile. Naomi accepted the glass, her fingers steady around the thin crystal stem, though she did not drink. Across the room, Alexander Whitmore had already resumed his role as host. He spoke calmly with a group of investors near the grand fireplace, his expression composed, the same confident calm that had built a billion-dollar empire from a small technology firm barely a decade earlier. To anyone watching, he appeared perfectly at ease. Yet Naomi noticed the subtle shift in the way he positioned himself, the careful angle of his shoulders, the quiet distance he now kept between them. It was the posture of a man who had already moved forward while the rest of the room was still catching up. Charlotte Whitmore moved gracefully through the guests, accepting congratulations, as if the strange announcement had been the most natural thing in the world. Her smile never wavered. Several women from Manhattan society surrounded her, their voices bright with polite excitement. Yet Naomi saw how Charlotte carefully guided the conversation each time someone asked a question that strayed too close to the truth. Vanessa Cole remained nearby, elegant and calm, the pale shimmer of her dress reflecting the warm chandelier light as though she had stepped directly from a winter fashion advertisement. She had finally taken a small sip of champagne. When her gaze briefly met Naomi's across the ballroom, she offered a gentle smile that might have appeared friendly to anyone else. Naomi returned the look without expression. For 5 years Naomi had lived inside the Whitmore world, and she had learned something important about power. The loudest moment in any room was rarely the most important one. The real story always moved quietly beneath the surface, hidden in the spaces where people believed no one was paying attention. A burst of laughter rose from the far side of the ballroom where a group of younger entrepreneurs had gathered around Alexander. One of them lifted his glass in a congratulatory toast, assuming the announcement meant some extraordinary family celebration. Alexander accepted the toast with a polite nod. The firelight behind him flickered across the polished marble floor, stretching his shadow across the room until it nearly touched the staircase where Naomi stood. She watched the moment carefully, the way his smile appeared at exactly the right time, the way the room responded to him the way it always had. Confidence, control, narrative. Those three things had built Alexander Whitmore's empire. And tonight he had used them again. Naomi set the untouched champagne glass on a nearby table and slowly walked toward the tall windows that overlooked the snow-covered gardens behind the estate. Outside, the city looked peaceful beneath the falling snow, the distant skyline glowing softly against the dark winter sky. From inside the glass, the laughter and music sounded distant, like echoes from another life. Naomi placed her hand lightly against the cool window and watched the snow settle across the hedges and stone pathways. Christmas lights wrapped around the trees in the garden cast gentle reflections across the glass, small golden circles floating across the dark night. It would have been a beautiful scene to anyone else. Behind her, the party continued with renewed energy as the orchestra shifted into another holiday melody and servers moved through the crowd carrying trays of desserts. The Whitmore Christmas celebration was famous in Manhattan for its elegance and spectacle. By morning, the photos from tonight would appear across social pages and society columns. Smiling guests framed beneath crystal chandeliers, a powerful family celebrating the holiday season. Yet Naomi understood something the cameras would never capture. This night had not been designed for celebration. It had been designed for positioning, for narrative, for the quiet rewriting of a story that involved far more than a strange announcement about family news. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment and let the music drift through the room. Then she opened them again and looked out across the snow-covered garden as a single realization settled calmly into her thoughts. Alexander believed he had already shaped the story everyone would remember from this night. What he did not know was that stories built on careful illusions rarely survive the arrival of truth. And somewhere beneath the polished elegance of the Whitmore estate, the truth had already begun moving toward the surface. The glass of the tall window remained cool beneath Naomi Carter Whitmore's fingertips as the party behind her slowly returned to its polished rhythm. the orchestra gliding into another gentle holiday melody, while laughter rose again beneath the high ceilings of the Whitmore estate. But Naomi no longer heard the music the same way, because once a truth reveals itself, even in the smallest whisper, the world never quite sounds the same again. She watched the snow drifting across the garden outside, the flakes falling softly over the sculpted hedges and quiet stone fountain. And for a brief moment, the peaceful winter scene allowed her to remember a different Christmas 5 years earlier, when she had first entered this house as Alexander Whitmore's wife. That night the mansion had looked exactly the same. The chandeliers had shimmered. The tree had reached nearly to the second-floor balcony. Guests had filled the ballroom with admiration for the young couple, whose marriage symbolized both love and ambition. Naomi had believed then that the future unfolding before her would be steady and strong, like the marble columns of the estate itself. She had not yet learned that power often moved like water beneath polished floors, shifting quietly while appearances remained unchanged. Behind her, the ballroom doors opened and closed as new guests arrived from the snowy driveway, bringing with them gusts of cold winter air that carried the scent of pine and distant city streets. Naomi turned slightly and saw Charlotte Whitmore guiding a group of society women toward the dessert tables, while Vanessa Cole followed with a smile that seemed practiced enough to belong in a political campaign. The two women moved together with careful coordination that most people in the room would simply call elegance. Naomi recognized something else. Timing. Vanessa paused to speak briefly with a reporter from a Manhattan lifestyle magazine who had been invited to document the evening, and Naomi noticed how Charlotte remained nearby, ensuring the conversation stayed cheerful and controlled. In wealthy circles, information rarely appeared by accident. It was introduced carefully, like a guest arriving through the front door. Naomi stepped away from the window and moved slowly along the edge of the ballroom, where the light was softer and conversations were easier to observe without becoming part of them. The marble floor reflected the golden glow of hundreds of tiny Christmas lights wrapped around garlands that draped along the balcony railing above. Every detail of the Whitmore Christmas celebration had always been precise. Naomi remembered the long afternoons she had spent planning previous holiday events, selecting musicians, arranging menus, ensuring every guest felt welcomed in the home she had tried so carefully to make warm despite its enormous size. Tonight she saw the same room differently. Now the decorations felt less like celebration and more like stage design. Across the ballroom, Alexander Whitmore finished another conversation and walked toward the grand staircase with the calm focus of a man moving through a boardroom meeting rather than a holiday gathering. Several guests stepped aside instinctively as he passed. Influence had a gravity of its own. When he reached the base of the staircase, his gaze moved briefly across the room until it found Naomi standing near one of the tall columns. Their eyes met again for the second time that evening. The distance between them was only about 30 feet, yet it felt far wider than the snowy garden outside. Alexander held her gaze for a moment that stretched just long enough to confirm what Naomi had already begun to understand. There would be no explanation tonight. No quiet conversation behind closed doors. The story had already been released into the room, and he intended to let it grow exactly the way he had designed it. Naomi felt the calm clarity inside her mind strengthen rather than fade. The strange announcement earlier had not been meant to celebrate new life. It had been meant to redirect attention, to move the narrative of the Whitmore family in a direction that left certain truths buried beneath polite applause. Naomi turned away from Alexander and began walking toward the front corridor that led to the long gallery overlooking the driveway. As she passed the enormous Christmas tree, its glass ornaments reflected her image in dozens of tiny curved surfaces, fragments of emerald fabric and dark hair moving through golden light. Somewhere in the ballroom, the orchestra reached the final note of another song, and guests applauded lightly before beginning a new round of conversations. Naomi continued walking until the music softened behind her, and the quiet hallway ahead offered a moment of stillness. She did not know every detail of the story Alexander believed he had constructed tonight, but she understood something essential about it already. Stories built too carefully often contained a weakness hidden within their design, and sometimes that weakness revealed itself not through confrontation, but through time. Naomi reached the end of the gallery and looked once more through the tall windows toward the snowy driveway where a line of black cars waited beneath falling snowflakes. In exactly 3 weeks, the quiet balance inside this house would shift again, and when it did, the carefully polished version of tonight would begin to crack in ways no one inside the ballroom was prepared to witness. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quiet in a way that almost felt unreal compared to the warmth and celebration behind Naomi Carter Whitmore. The sound of the orchestra softened into a distant echo as she walked slowly along the long gallery lined with tall windows that overlooked the snow-covered driveway. Outside the estate, a row of black luxury cars waited beneath the falling snow, their headlights glowing softly against the winter night, while chauffeurs stood patiently near the front steps. Naomi paused beside one of the windows and watched the slow movement of snowflakes drifting under the lantern lights. The air inside the gallery carried the faint scent of pine garlands and polished wood, the kind of quiet elegance that had once made the Whitmore estate feel like a place of belonging. Tonight it felt different. Not colder exactly, but clearer. The kind of clarity that appears when a person finally understands that something carefully hidden has been unfolding for a long time. Naomi remembered the first year she had celebrated Christmas in this house. Alexander had stood beside her at the balcony railing overlooking the ballroom while guests admired the enormous tree and the orchestra played holiday music. He had taken her hand and whispered that she made the house feel alive in a way it never had before. At the time, Naomi had believed him. She had believed that love could reshape even the oldest traditions of power. 5 years later, she understood that traditions built over generations rarely changed because of love. They changed only when the story surrounding them collapsed. Behind her, the ballroom doors opened and closed again as laughter spilled briefly into the hallway before fading once more into the distance. Naomi heard footsteps approaching across the marble floor and did not need to turn to know who it was. Alexander Whitmore stopped a few feet behind her, his reflection appearing faintly in the glass of the window beside her shoulder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily across the quiet gardens and stone fountain. Finally, Alexander broke the silence with the calm voice he used during difficult negotiations. "You left the party early," he said. Naomi did not turn around. "The party seems to be doing just fine without me," she replied softly. The reflection of Alexander in the window shifted slightly as he stepped closer, the faint glow of the hallway lights catching the silver edge of his cufflinks. "The announcement surprised people," he said after a moment. Naomi watched the snow gather along the curved branches of the garden trees. "It surprised me too," she answered. Alexander studied her reflection carefully. "Charlotte insisted it was better to say something tonight rather than allow rumors later," he said. The explanation sounded smooth, practiced, the kind of reasoning that fit easily into a boardroom presentation. Naomi finally turned slightly, enough to see him directly for the first time since he had followed her into the gallery. His expression remained controlled, but there was a faint tension in his eyes now, something deeper than the confident calm he had displayed earlier in the ballroom. Naomi held his gaze quietly. "You introduced the story very carefully," she said, as if you wanted the entire room to hear it at the same moment. Alexander did not answer immediately. The silence between them stretched for several seconds while distant music drifted faintly down the hallway. "Sometimes it is better to guide a story before it begins guiding you," he said at last. Naomi studied his face, noticing how easily the words came to him. Strategy had always been Alexander Whitmore's strongest talent. He could see outcomes before other people even understood the situation. Naomi nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a business insight. "And what story are you guiding tonight, Alexander?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked away from her for the first time and toward the snowy driveway beyond the glass. "One that protects the family," he said. Naomi felt the faintest trace of a smile appear on her lips, not out of humor, but recognition. Protecting the family had always been the phrase used whenever difficult truths needed to disappear behind polite explanations. She turned back toward the window and watched a new wave of guests arriving from the driveway as the estate doors opened again to welcome them into the warmth of the celebration. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi said something so softly it almost blended with the distant music drifting through the hallway. "Stories built to protect a family usually hide something else," she said. Alexander did not respond, but Naomi noticed how still he had become beside her. The snow continued falling outside beneath the lantern lights. And somewhere inside the enormous Whitmore estate, the quiet balance that had existed for years was beginning to shift in ways neither of them could fully control. Alexander Whitmore remained beside the tall window for several seconds after Naomi's quiet words settled into the stillness of the gallery. The distant music from the ballroom drifted through the corridor like a memory of celebration that no longer belonged to them. Outside, the snow continued falling across the gardens, soft and steady beneath the lantern lights that illuminated the stone paths winding through the Whitmore estate. Naomi Carter Whitmore kept her gaze on the quiet winter scene beyond the glass, her posture calm, her breathing slow and steady. For years she had learned that silence often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Alexander finally exhaled quietly, the faint reflection of his face visible in the darkened window beside her. "You are reading too much into this," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched a chauffeur step forward to open the door of a black sedan arriving at the front entrance, while a couple wrapped in elegant coats hurried through the falling snow toward the warm light of the estate. The party was continuing exactly as planned. Wealth had a way of protecting the illusion of normalcy, even when something underneath had shifted. Naomi turned slowly toward Alexander and studied his face with the quiet attentiveness she had developed over 5 years of marriage. "You introduced Vanessa tonight very carefully," she said softly. "Not directly, but close enough to the story that people will begin connecting the pieces themselves." Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Vanessa is working with Charlotte on several foundation projects," he replied. Naomi nodded once, as if acknowledging a familiar business explanation. "That is one way to describe it." The silence between them returned again, but this time it carried a different weight. Alexander moved a few steps toward the window, placing his hands lightly in his pockets as he looked out across the snow-covered garden. The lantern lights outside reflected faintly in his eyes. "The Whitmore family has always handled private matters carefully," he said after a moment. "Public perception matters." Naomi recognized the sentence instantly. It was the same language Alexander used when explaining market strategies to his executives. Perception, narrative, positioning. Naomi walked slowly down the length of the gallery, the soft sound of her heels echoing against the polished marble floor while Alexander remained near the window behind her. At the far end of the hallway, a large oil painting of the original Whitmore estate hung beneath a brass spotlight, the image showing the mansion as it had looked nearly 80 years earlier when Alexander's grandfather first built the family fortune. Naomi stopped in front of the painting and studied the image thoughtfully. The house had looked smaller then, less guarded, less calculated. Alexander approached quietly and stopped beside her. For a moment, they both looked at the painting without speaking. Finally, Naomi said something that seemed simple on the surface, yet carried the calm weight of realization. Tonight was not really about a pregnancy announcement. Alexander did not answer. Naomi continued studying the old painting. "It was about introducing a future explanation," she said. Alexander turned his head slightly toward her. Naomi met his gaze without anger or accusation, only a quiet steadiness that seemed to unsettle him more than confrontation ever could. 3 weeks from now," she said calmly, "something else will be announced." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem very certain." Naomi offered the faintest hint of a smile. "Because stories like this always unfold in stages," she replied. "First the room hears a strange truth. Then the truth slowly changes shape until everyone believes the version they were meant to believe." The distant sound of applause rose from the ballroom as another toast was made beneath the chandeliers. Naomi glanced briefly toward the sound before returning her attention to Alexander. "Tonight was the beginning," she said. Alexander studied her carefully, as if trying to measure how much she already understood. The calm confidence that had defined his presence earlier in the evening now seemed slightly less certain. Outside the gallery windows, the snow continued drifting across the estate gardens, covering the stone pathways in quiet layers of white. Naomi finally turned away from the painting and began walking back toward the ballroom entrance. When she reached the doorway, she paused and looked back at Alexander one final time. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Whatever story you believe you are guiding," she said softly, "you should be careful about how it ends." Then Naomi stepped back into the warm glow of the ballroom, where the Christmas celebration continued as if nothing had changed, while behind her Alexander Whitmore remained standing alone in the quiet gallery, realizing that the woman he believed he understood might already be several steps ahead of the narrative he had so carefully begun. The warmth of the ballroom returned around Naomi Carter Whitmore the moment she stepped back through the tall double doors, but the atmosphere felt different now that she had seen the quiet mechanics behind the evening's announcement. The orchestra continued playing beneath the crystal chandeliers, while guests laughed politely around tables filled with holiday desserts and sparkling glasses. From a distance, it looked like a perfect Christmas gathering, the kind that appeared in glossy magazine spreads about the most influential families in Manhattan. Naomi moved calmly along the edge of the room, acknowledging a few familiar faces with polite nods while her thoughts remained steady and focused. She noticed how several guests glanced toward her with careful curiosity before quickly returning to their conversations. News inside powerful circles traveled faster than snow across city rooftops, and the strange announcement earlier had already begun to circulate through the room in fragments of speculation. Near the grand fireplace, Charlotte Whitmore stood surrounded by a small group of social figures who were offering warm congratulations while attempting to hide their confusion. Charlotte responded with flawless composure, her smile elegant and reassuring as she redirected each question toward pleasant conversation about the Whitmore Family Foundation and upcoming charity initiatives. Naomi recognized the strategy instantly. When a story could not yet be explained, it was temporarily softened with generosity and celebration. Across the ballroom, Vanessa Cole remained near one of the tall columns, speaking quietly with the same lifestyle reporter Naomi had noticed earlier. The reporter's pen moved across a small notebook, while Vanessa maintained a graceful posture that suggested both humility and quiet significance. Naomi understood what the conversation would eventually become. Within days, the city's society pages would mention a surprising Whitmore family development connected to philanthropic work and personal sacrifice. The details would remain unclear enough to invite curiosity, but polished enough to protect reputations. Naomi stopped briefly beside the enormous Christmas tree rising toward the balcony above the ballroom floor. Hundreds of tiny lights shimmered across glass ornaments shaped like snowflakes and stars. In several of those ornaments, Naomi could see reflections of the room moving around her like small distorted worlds. One reflection showed Vanessa laughing softly with the reporter. Another reflected Charlotte raising a glass during another congratulatory toast. And one reflection captured Alexander Whitmore stepping back into the ballroom from the gallery corridor. Naomi lifted her eyes from the ornaments and watched Alexander as he moved across the room once again with the steady confidence of a man accustomed to guiding attention wherever he chose. Guests turned toward him instinctively as he approached, eager to remain connected to the center of influence. He stopped briefly near Charlotte and Vanessa, exchanging a quiet few words that were hidden behind the hum of conversation and music. Naomi did not need to hear the discussion to understand its purpose. Tonight's announcement had only been the opening move. The real narrative would begin shaping itself in the coming weeks through carefully placed comments, articles, and appearances. Wealth and influence rarely revealed a story all at once. Instead, they allowed the story to bloom slowly until the public believed it had discovered the truth on its own. Naomi walked toward one of the tall marble pillars near the center of the ballroom, where she could see the entire room clearly. From that vantage point, she watched the Whitmore Christmas celebration unfold like a carefully choreographed performance. Every gesture, every conversation, every camera flash from the society reporters formed part of the same quiet structure. And yet Naomi felt something unexpected rising within her. Not anger, not panic, something far steadier. Awareness. Over the past 5 years, she had listened carefully in rooms exactly like this one while investors and advisors spoke freely around her, believing she was merely the quiet wife of the billionaire host. They had underestimated how closely she observed patterns of strategy and timing. Naomi knew how influence traveled through media, charity boards, and private social networks. She knew how quickly a narrative could reshape public opinion when delivered with enough confidence. which meant she also understood something Alexander might not yet realize. Stories built through influence could shift direction just as quickly when a new piece of truth entered the conversation. Naomi reached for a small glass of water from a passing tray and took a slow sip while watching the room continue celebrating beneath the shimmering lights. Alexander's gaze moved across the ballroom again and briefly met hers from across the crowd. This time neither of them looked away immediately. The distance between them felt different now. Not wider, but sharper. Naomi placed the empty glass back onto the tray and offered the server a polite thank you before stepping away toward the quieter edge of the room. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, snow continued falling over Manhattan, covering the city in a quiet winter calm that seemed to promise reflection and change. Naomi Carter Whitmore understood one thing with perfect clarity as the evening continued unfolding around her. Tonight had been the first move in a carefully planned story. But stories had a way of evolving once the people inside them began to see the full shape of the truth. The celebration inside the Whitmore estate continued deep into the evening. Yet Naomi Carter Whitmore sensed the subtle shift that often followed a carefully placed announcement. Conversations were still warm. The orchestra continued playing gentle holiday melodies, and waiters moved gracefully through the ballroom, carrying trays of sparkling drinks and delicate desserts. But beneath the elegant surface, the guests were no longer simply enjoying Christmas. They were watching, observing, measuring the story that had been introduced earlier in the night. Naomi moved quietly toward a smaller sitting area near the far side of the ballroom, where tall windows looked out over the snowy gardens. A pair of elderly donors from the Whitmore Foundation greeted her politely as she passed, offering warm smiles that carried a trace of curiosity. Naomi returned the smiles with the calm grace she had perfected over years in rooms like this. She sat briefly on the edge of a velvet chair beside the window and allowed herself a moment of stillness while the distant laughter of guests floated through the air behind her. Outside, the snow had grown heavier. The garden paths were now coated in a smooth white layer that reflected the soft lantern lights surrounding the estate. Naomi watched the quiet scene carefully, her thoughts aligning with the same steady clarity she had felt earlier in the evening. Across the ballroom, Charlotte Whitmore was now speaking with a group of philanthropic board members who appeared fascinated by whatever explanation she was offering about the surprising family news. Vanessa Cole stood nearby, occasionally nodding with gentle modesty as if she had been reluctantly drawn into a story much larger than herself. Naomi noticed how the reporter from earlier had moved closer again, capturing photographs and jotting notes with growing interest. The foundation for the coming narrative was already forming. Alexander Whitmore moved through the crowd with his usual calm authority, pausing to greet guests and exchange brief conversations that appeared perfectly normal to anyone watching casually. Yet Naomi observed something in his timing that most people in the room would never notice. Each time he spoke with someone influential, he allowed the topic of the evening's announcement to surface naturally through curiosity rather than explanation. He did not correct misunderstandings. He simply allowed the speculation to grow in a direction that would later be easy to shape. Naomi leaned back slightly in the velvet chair and folded her hands calmly in her lap. 5 years earlier, she might have felt unsettled watching such a carefully controlled narrative unfold around her. Tonight, she felt something different. Understanding. She remembered countless business dinners where Alexander had explained that the strongest strategy was rarely confrontation. The strongest strategy was patience. Allow people to believe they have discovered the story themselves, and they will defend it even when the truth changes. Naomi realized that the same principle now surrounded her own life. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Whitmore," the car service manager asked, "whether you will be departing soon." Naomi looked up to see one of the household staff standing respectfully nearby. The young man had served at several Whitmore events over the years and greeted her with genuine kindness. Naomi offered him a gentle smile. "Not yet," she replied. "Thank you." The staff member nodded and quietly stepped away. Naomi turned her gaze back toward the ballroom, where the evening continued glowing beneath the chandelier light. She noticed Alexander speaking again with the reporter now, his expression calm as he offered a brief comment. That caused the reporter to nod with renewed interest. Charlotte stood just a few feet away, her posture relaxed as if the conversation had unfolded exactly as expected. Naomi rose slowly from the velvet chair and walked back toward the edge of the crowd, moving gracefully through the warm light of the ballroom. As she passed near the enormous Christmas tree, she caught another reflection of herself in one of the glass ornaments. The reflection appeared slightly curved, but the calm confidence in her posture remained unmistakable. Naomi paused for a moment and studied that reflection carefully. She understood the story that was being written tonight. A powerful family announcement. A surprising development that would soon evolve into a tale of sacrifice, legacy, and carefully explained circumstances. Within 3 weeks, the city's media and social circles would likely believe they knew exactly what had happened inside the Whitmore family. Naomi stepped away from the tree and allowed her gaze to travel once more across the entire ballroom. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. Music swelled softly beneath the glowing chandeliers. And somewhere within the polished beauty of the evening, a quiet truth remained hidden, waiting for the moment when it would finally change the direction of the story that Alexander Whitmore believed he had already placed under his control. The hour grew later, and the celebration inside the Whitmore estate began to soften into the quieter rhythm that always followed a long evening of social gatherings. The orchestra shifted into slower melodies, the kind that allowed conversations to drift gently rather than compete with music. Outside the tall windows, snow continued falling steadily across Manhattan, blanketing the gardens and the winding driveway in a smooth white silence that felt far removed from the warmth and glitter of the ballroom. Naomi Carter Whitmore stood near the edge of the crowd beside a marble pillar, observing the room with the calm patience she had learned over years spent among people who believed influence could shape every outcome. In many ways it could, but Naomi also understood that influence required constant control, and control became fragile the moment something unexpected entered the story. Across the ballroom, Alexander Whitmore remained surrounded by guests, his posture relaxed, his voice measured as he spoke with a group of financial executives who had flown in from Chicago earlier that afternoon. Naomi watched him carefully. To anyone else he looked exactly as he always had during gatherings like this. Confident, composed, slightly distant in the way powerful people often were. Yet Naomi noticed the faint pauses between his sentences tonight, the moments where his gaze traveled briefly across the room, as if measuring reactions that could not yet be predicted. Charlotte Whitmore soon joined the group with her usual elegance, her silver hair catching the chandelier light as she greeted the executives with gracious warmth. Vanessa Cole followed only a moment later, and the four of them stood together in a small circle that looked, to the rest of the guests, like nothing more than polite conversation among friends and colleagues. Naomi knew better. Every arrangement of people in that room tonight had purpose. The reporter Naomi had noticed earlier now stood near the edge of the gathering with a camera hanging from his shoulder and a small notebook in hand. He waited patiently until the group laughed together at something Charlotte said before raising the camera and capturing a photograph. The flash of light reflected across the marble floor, and several nearby guests smiled toward the lens. Naomi recognized the moment for what it was. Tomorrow the photograph would appear in one of the city's lifestyle columns, perhaps accompanied by a short article mentioning the Whitmore family celebration and the surprising announcement that had stirred so much curiosity among Manhattan social circles. Naomi stepped slowly away from the pillar and moved toward a quiet table near the window where several untouched glasses of water rested beside small arrangements of winter roses. She lifted one glass and took a slow sip while watching the reflection of the ballroom in the dark window pane. The glass showed a faint mirror image of the entire room behind her. In that reflection, Naomi could see Charlotte's poised smile, Vanessa's graceful posture, and Alexander's calm expression as he continued speaking with the executives. The scene appeared perfect in the reflection, like a carefully balanced portrait of wealth and harmony. Yet Naomi knew that reflections often hid the most important details. The quiet truth moving beneath the surface of the evening was not something the guests would understand tonight. It was something that would reveal itself gradually, one piece at a time. Naomi lowered the glass and rested it gently back on the table. She remembered the words Alexander had spoken earlier in the gallery about guiding the story before the story guided him. It had sounded like wisdom then, the kind of strategic thinking that had helped him build his empire. But Naomi understood something now that perhaps he had overlooked. Stories were not only shaped by the people who started them. They were also shaped by the people who knew when to let the truth arrive at exactly the right moment. Naomi turned away from the window and walked slowly toward the balcony overlooking the ballroom. From that vantage point, she could see the entire celebration unfolding below her like a quiet stage performance beneath the shimmering chandeliers. Guests moved in gentle patterns across the marble floor. Servers carried trays of desserts between small groups of laughing couples. The orchestra continued its soft holiday melodies. And at the center of the room, Alexander Whitmore remained the calm focal point of attention, the man who believed he had already placed the evening's narrative safely within his control. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the balcony railing and looked down at the scene with steady clarity. Somewhere beyond the walls of the estate, the city of New York continued its quiet winter night beneath falling snow. In 3 weeks, the story that had begun here would change shape completely. And when that moment arrived, the carefully polished explanation surrounding the Whitmore family would no longer belong to Alexander alone. By the time the clock above the grand fireplace approached midnight, the Whitmore Christmas celebration had settled into a slower rhythm of lingering conversations and quiet laughter. Many guests had begun preparing to leave, collecting coats from attendants and offering warm goodbyes beneath the glowing chandeliers. Outside the estate, the snow had grown deeper, soft white layers covering the long curved driveway and the manicured hedges that framed the gardens. Naomi Carter Whitmore remained on the balcony overlooking the ballroom, her hands resting lightly on the polished railing as she watched the final hours of the evening unfold. From above, the room looked almost peaceful, the soft golden light reflecting off marble floors while the orchestra played a gentle instrumental version of a familiar holiday melody. It would have appeared to any outsider like the perfect conclusion to an elegant Christmas gathering. Yet Naomi knew that the evening had quietly altered something fundamental inside the Whitmore family. Across the ballroom, Alexander Whitmore was saying goodbye to a group of departing guests near the entrance hall, his voice calm and gracious as he thanked them for attending. His composure had not faltered once throughout the night. If anything, he appeared even more confident now, as though the announcement earlier had unfolded exactly as he intended. Charlotte Whitmore stood nearby, offering elegant farewells to longtime donors from the family foundation, her posture dignified, her voice warm as she spoke about upcoming charity events planned for the new year. Vanessa Cole remained just behind them, her presence carefully understated yet impossible to ignore. Naomi watched the three of them together and understood how easily the world outside this estate would soon accept the story being prepared. Within days, the society pages would likely describe a surprising but inspiring family development connected to the Whitmore legacy. The details would be polished, the timing carefully framed, and the public would see only what they were meant to see. Naomi turned slightly and looked out through the tall windows behind her. The snow outside had softened the entire landscape into quiet stillness. The lantern lights along the garden paths glowed faintly beneath the falling flakes, and beyond the estate walls the distant skyline of Manhattan shimmered against the dark winter sky. Naomi breathed slowly, allowing the cool reflection of the glass beside her to anchor her thoughts. Earlier that evening, Alexander had spoken about guiding the story before the story guided him. The sentence had sounded powerful when he first said it in the quiet gallery hallway. Now Naomi understood how fragile that kind of control could be. Stories built on careful planning often assumed that every element would behave exactly as expected. But life had a way of introducing variables that no strategy could fully predict. Naomi stepped away from the balcony railing and walked slowly down the curved staircase leading back to the ballroom floor. The orchestra was finishing its final song of the evening, and several guests applauded softly while preparing to leave. A server passed Naomi carrying a tray of empty glasses and offered her a respectful nod. Naomi returned the gesture with a small smile before moving toward the entrance hall where the remaining guests gathered their coats. As she approached the doorway, Alexander noticed her and paused his conversation with a departing executive. For a moment, the two of them stood facing each other across the marble floor while the final notes of music faded into the high ceiling above. Alexander stepped forward calmly. "The evening went well," he said quietly. Naomi studied his expression with the same steady calm she had carried all night. "Yes," she replied. "It unfolded exactly the way you wanted." Alexander's eyes searched her face as if measuring the meaning behind her words. Naomi continued before he could respond. Stories introduced on nights like this rarely remain quiet for long. Alexander held her gaze. Sometimes that is the intention, he said. Naomi nodded slowly as though acknowledging a familiar truth. Then I suppose we will both see where this one goes. Another group of guests approached the entrance behind them, and the moment passed as Alexander turned to greet them politely. Naomi stepped toward the coat attendant who handed her a long winter coat lined with soft wool. She slipped it on calmly and walked toward the front doors of the Whitmore estate. When the doors opened, a rush of cold winter air drifted inside, carrying the scent of fresh snow and distant city streets. Naomi stepped onto the stone entryway and looked out across the quiet white driveway where cars waited beneath the falling snow. Somewhere inside the glowing mansion behind her, the final guests continued saying their goodbyes, while the carefully crafted narrative of the evening began preparing to travel beyond those walls. Naomi Carter Whitmore understood something with perfect clarity as she descended the front steps into the silent winter night. In 3 weeks, the story that had begun tonight would no longer belong only to the people who had tried to control it. 3 weeks later, Manhattan looked very different from the quiet winter night when the Whitmore Christmas celebration had ended. The snow had long melted from the sidewalks, and the city had returned to its restless rhythm of traffic, flashing lights, and crowded morning streets. Yet inside the glass towers of Manhattan's business district, the name Whitmore had continued appearing in conversations, articles, and quiet speculation among the city's most connected circles. Naomi Carter Whitmore stood beside the wide window of her apartment overlooking Central Park, watching the pale winter sunlight stretch across the frozen lake below. The air inside the room was calm, filled only with the faint sound of a coffee machine finishing its quiet cycle on the kitchen counter behind her. Over the past 3 weeks, the narrative that had begun during the Christmas celebration had unfolded exactly the way Naomi had expected. The first article appeared just 2 days after the event, a polished piece in one of the city's most widely read society publications describing a surprising Whitmore family announcement connected to a deeply personal sacrifice. The article mentioned Charlotte Whitmore's unexpected pregnancy and hinted that the family would soon share more details about a private medical arrangement meant to support the continuation of the Whitmore legacy. Several photographs from the Christmas celebration accompanied the article, including one showing Alexander standing beside Charlotte and Vanessa beneath the chandelier light. Naomi had studied the image carefully when it appeared online. The positioning had been deliberate. Vanessa stood slightly closer to Charlotte than anyone else in the photograph, her hand resting gently on Charlotte's arm. It was the visual seed of a story that had not yet been fully told. Over the following weeks, the speculation had grown exactly as planned. A second article described whispers about a complicated medical situation involving surrogacy and a rare condition affecting someone within the Whitmore family. Commentators on social platforms began suggesting that the Whitmore legacy might soon be secured through an extraordinary arrangement involving both family loyalty and modern medicine. Naomi turned away from the window and walked slowly across the quiet apartment toward the dining table where several newspapers and digital tablets lay open. Each one displayed some version of the same developing story. Naomi lifted one tablet and read the headline of the most recent article published that morning. The wording was careful but unmistakable. Sources close to the Whitmore family suggest the recent announcement may be connected to a private surrogacy agreement involving longtime family associate Vanessa Cole. Naomi set the tablet down gently and allowed herself a slow breath. The final stage of the narrative was beginning exactly on schedule. Soon the public explanation would arrive. Charlotte Whitmore would likely appear in a carefully arranged interview explaining that the pregnancy announcement during Christmas had been a misunderstanding designed to protect Vanessa's privacy while she carried a child connected to the Whitmore family. The explanation would frame Vanessa as a selfless figure willing to help preserve a powerful legacy. And somewhere within that story, Naomi Carter Whitmore would quietly disappear from the conversation entirely. Naomi walked back toward the window and rested, her hand lightly against the cool glass as she looked out across the park once more. She had known from the moment Alexander made his announcement that the story would eventually lead here. But what Alexander had never asked himself was a far more important question. What if the person he intended to erase from the narrative had already prepared the truth that would replace it? Naomi reached into the pocket of her coat hanging beside the door and removed a small white envelope that had arrived earlier that morning. Inside the envelope was a single printed document bearing the letterhead of a respected medical laboratory in Boston. Naomi opened the envelope and read the report once again, though she already knew every word by heart. The test results were clear, undeniable, a fact that no public relations strategy could easily redirect once it entered the conversation. Naomi placed the report back into the envelope and looked out across the bright winter skyline of Manhattan. Somewhere inside the towering offices of Whitmore Technologies, Alexander Whitmore likely believed the story he had introduced 3 weeks earlier was finally reaching its perfect conclusion. Naomi Carter Whitmore understood something very different as she slipped the envelope back into her coat pocket. The real conclusion to the story had not yet been written. The following morning, Manhattan awakened beneath a pale winter sun that reflected softly across the glass towers of its financial district. And inside the headquarters of Whitmore Technologies, the atmosphere carried the quiet intensity of a company preparing for an important announcement. Naomi Carter Whitmore stepped out of the elevator into the marble reception lobby with calm confidence, her long dark coat draped neatly over a tailored charcoal dress that matched the quiet determination in her posture. The lobby was expansive and filled with natural light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Fifth Avenue, and employees moving through the space paused subtly when they noticed her arrival. Although Naomi had rarely appeared at the corporate headquarters in recent months, she was still widely recognized as the wife of the company's founder. Several reception staff offered polite greetings while a young assistant stepped forward to ask if she needed help. Naomi returned their courtesy with a warm but composed smile. "I have a scheduled meeting with Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly. The assistant nodded quickly and gestured toward the private executive elevators reserved for senior leadership. As Naomi stepped into the elevator, the doors closed with a soft metallic whisper, and the car began its smooth ascent toward the top floors where Alexander Whitmore's office overlooked the entire city skyline. Naomi allowed the quiet moment inside the elevator to steady her thoughts. In her coat pocket, the white envelope containing the medical report remained perfectly flat against the lining. The document inside it had the power to unravel the carefully structured narrative that had grown over the past 3 weeks. But Naomi understood something important about truth. Truth did not need to shout. It only needed to arrive in the right room at the right moment. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The hallway was lined with dark wood panels and framed photographs celebrating the milestones of Whitmore Technologies, from its first small office nearly 15 years earlier to the towering corporate headquarters that now dominated a section of Manhattan's skyline. Naomi walked quietly down the corridor toward the glass doors of Alexander's office suite, where his executive assistant rose from her desk with visible surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore," the assistant said politely, "I did not realize you were scheduled to visit today." Naomi's voice remained gentle but firm. "I believe Alexander will want to see me," she replied. The assistant hesitated for a moment before pressing a button on her desk phone and speaking softly into the receiver. After a brief pause, she nodded and gestured toward the office doors. "He will see you now." Naomi stepped through the doors into Alexander Whitmore's office, where sunlight poured through the massive windows behind his desk, illuminating the city stretching far below like a living map of ambition and success. Alexander stood near the window, speaking on his phone, his expression focused as he discussed something with one of his senior advisors. When he noticed Naomi entering the room, he ended the call quickly and set the phone on his desk. "Naomi," he said with measured surprise, "I was not expecting you." Naomi closed the door quietly behind her and walked toward the center of the office, her movements calm and deliberate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different from the quiet tension that had filled the gallery hallway on Christmas night. This silence carried something heavier, something final. Alexander folded his arms slightly as he studied her face. "Is there something you need?" he asked. Naomi reached into the pocket of her coat and removed the white envelope. She held it carefully for a moment before placing it on the polished surface of his desk between them. Alexander glanced at the envelope with mild curiosity. "What is this?" he asked. Naomi met his gaze steadily. The truth that your story forgot to account for, she said softly. Alexander's expression tightened as he opened the envelope and removed the single page inside. His eyes moved quickly across the medical report printed on the page. For the first time since Naomi had entered the office, his composure faltered. The test results were unmistakable. They revealed something that no public relations narrative could reshape once it became known. Alexander slowly lowered the paper and looked up at Naomi with a mixture of disbelief and realization. Naomi's voice remained calm as winter light reflected across the city skyline behind him. Stories can be guided for a while, she said quietly, but the truth always arrives eventually. Alexander Whitmore remained standing behind his desk for several long seconds after reading the document in his hands, the winter sunlight from the massive windows behind him stretching across the polished floor and illuminating the silence that had filled the office. Naomi Carter Whitmore did not move. She simply watched him with the same calm patience she had carried since the moment she stepped into the building. The medical report rested lightly in Alexander's grip, but the weight of what it revealed had already begun to shift the carefully balanced world he believed he controlled. His eyes moved once more across the printed lines before lifting slowly to meet Naomi's gaze. For the first time since the story began 3 weeks earlier, there was no strategy in his expression, no quiet calculation guiding the next sentence. There was only realization. Naomi spoke gently, her voice steady and composed. The report was completed 2 weeks before Christmas, she said. I asked for the test after your mother suggested that our family situation might become a topic of conversation this year. Alexander lowered the paper slightly, his brow tightening as the pieces of the story he had constructed began rearranging themselves in his mind. Naomi continued with quiet clarity. The results are simple. The pregnancy Vanessa is carrying cannot be connected to the Whitmore family in the way the public narrative suggests. The sunlight shifted slightly across the office windows as clouds moved slowly above the city skyline. For years, Alexander Whitmore had believed that influence, timing, and preparation could guide any outcome. Yet the document in his hands revealed a flaw in the story that could not be smoothed away through careful messaging or polished explanations. Naomi stepped closer to the desk, resting her hands lightly against the polished surface as she spoke. When the story reaches the final stage in the coming days, the public will expect an explanation that confirms everything they have been led to believe. A legacy secured, a sacrifice honored, a powerful family preserved. She paused briefly before finishing the thought. But the truth does not support that version. Alexander exhaled slowly and placed the medical report back inside the envelope, his movements measured but no longer fully controlled. The confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations across the world now faced something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Naomi studied his face with calm understanding. She had known this moment would come from the first instant she saw the narrative forming around Vanessa and Charlotte during the Christmas celebration. You once told me that the strongest strategy is guiding the story before the story guides you, Naomi said quietly. That advice was correct. Alexander looked up at her again, the tension in his expression now mixed with something deeper. Regret. Naomi reached into her coat pocket once more and removed a second document, placing it beside the envelope already on the desk. This one will reach the same reporters who have been following your family story, she explained calmly. Not today, but soon. Alexander stared at the paper without opening it, understanding that the balance of control had shifted completely. Naomi straightened slowly and stepped back from the desk. The quiet authority in her posture carried none of the anger that might have been expected. Instead, it carried dignity, clarity, and the quiet strength of someone who had finally stepped outside the narrative written for her. You were right about one thing, she said gently. Stories do shape the way the world understands people. She turned toward the door of the office where the bright winter light reflected softly along the hallway beyond. Before leaving, she looked back at Alexander one final time. But the strongest story is always the one built on truth. Naomi Carter Whitmore opened the door and walked calmly out of the office, leaving the city skyline glowing behind Alexander Whitmore as he stood alone with the documents that revealed how fragile even the most carefully designed narrative could become when the truth finally arrived.